get started, thank you for joining us on the Courageous Leaders Speaker Series for our panel discussion today. I am Katie. I am the Chief Program Officer at the Chapman Foundation for Caring Communities. And also from the foundation today, we have Heather McDermott, the Senior Director of Content and Coaching, and Lainey, who is our Content Quality and Logistics Specialist. So throughout the day today, if you have any questions or need any assistance with your technology, please feel free to drop something in the chat and they'll be able to help you out as well. As we get started today, I kind of want to just level set with an agenda so you know the flow of the call. In just a minute here, I'm going to give you a quick overview of where we're at in the Courageous Leader series and introduce you to our panel members for today. The first part of the question and answer section, I'll be referring back to some concepts that we covered in our Living in an Ever-Changing World session that we did previously in the series. If you have not had an opportunity to attend that or listen to the recording, Lainey will go ahead and drop that in the chat. So you'll always have it to refer back to if there's a concept that interests you a lot from today. And then after we wrap up that portion of questions that are going to be posed to our panelists, you'll have an opportunity to do open Q&A. So at any point throughout the session, if you think of a question that you'd like to have the panelists answer, feel free to drop that in the chat. And then at the end, Lainey and Heather will be able to pull those up and we'll use the end of the session for that time. And then finally, as you will probably hear us say in every session, we want to end with having you consider some next steps for your organization, thinking about what you can take from today's call and what is your next action item. So as we go today, it might be helpful for you to be thinking about some change initiatives that are taking place in your own organization, or maybe reflecting back on what was it that inspired you to attend the call today. If you are a person who likes to be able to jot down notes as you follow along to make sure that you're remembering your key takeaways, Lainey's going to go ahead and drop in the chat a thought organizer. So feel free to have that open on your screen if you want to capture some of your thoughts. And again, just that reminder that at any point you have questions for the panelists, please feel free to drop them in the chat. You don't have to wait until the very end for that. In our speaker series, we are here on our fourth session, and this is our panel discussion about leading in an ever-changing world. And the panel members that I'm about to introduce you to are all alumni of our foundational courses that we offer. Some of you may have attended these. They'll be referring to some of the concepts from class. We have our Community Listens, where we really focus on those communication skills to connect well with others. Our Community Serves, where we really talk about developing a service mindset and service behaviors so we can start shifting cultures from me-centric to we-centric. And then our Community Transforms, where we work with leaders on how to create environments for well-being and flourishing within their teams and their organizations. So let's go ahead and meet our panelists for today. First, you'll see on the left here, we have Talita Garcia, who is the HR Director in the town of Snowmass Village in Colorado. Talita, thanks so much for joining us today.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
We also have David Howell, the Leadership Excellence System Manager from the Medical University of South Carolina Health System. David, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Welcome, everyone.
And then we also, I need to slide my camera over for a second. Sorry, Aaron, I can't see your title on the bottom there. We also have Aaron Wojkiewicz, who's the AVP of Learning and Development at the Capital Credit Union in Wisconsin. Aaron, thanks for being here.
Hi, everybody. I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
We're looking forward to getting to hear all of your different perspectives and experiences around change management. And as you see on the chart here, there is a very good reason as to why this is a topic that leaders often want to learn more about. When you look at some of the research, it would show that only 17% of business professionals rate their organizations as being highly effective at managing change. And that stat makes it not so surprising then to read on the right that 70% of organizational change initiatives end up in failure. So this is a topic that is very relevant because we feel like we're not being very highly effective. Organizations are seeing a high level of failure in managing change, and yet change seems to happen all the time in every organization. So our very first question for the panelists is just to have you tell us a little bit about your previous experience and thought process around change management. And that can be both as an individual or as an organization, and just have you talk a little bit about some of the struggles that you've experienced. So for this one, David, why don't you go ahead and kick us off, please?
Sounds good, Katie. Thank you. So I'm going to look at this sort of in two different ways. One is from the perspective as an organization as a whole, and then I'll talk a little bit about how I've struggled with change as an individual. So I'll just start by saying, as a medical university of South Carolina, right, we are the premier academic health center in the state of South Carolina. The vastness of who we are as an organization presents change itself. And then you struggle with the dynamics of how healthcare is the epitome of change, right? I mean, I remember during COVID, during the pandemic, I felt like operationally we were changing every hour because one, we didn't know what COVID was, right? And two, how do we protect our patients? How do we protect our employees and do what we need to as an organization to shift quickly? So because we didn't know what COVID was and because we didn't know what we were dealing with, there were often times where we weren't able to communicate to all of our employees about why it's best to move our, OR into an ICU area, or why we need people to shift all across the organization as it affects patients. So, sometimes time is not on our side with being such a large healthcare organization where communication is a struggle. People resonate in different ways. So being able to connect with people is often a struggle as well, right? Because people respond in different ways. We're going to, talk about the box as we go on here in a few minutes, but really being mindful of how people process change differently and really being able to treat people in that way and letting people have what they need to process that change, I think is a struggle for anyone, especially an academic health center where we have thousands upon thousands of people who are different, who handle change differently. We have such a vast, diversity in terms of who we are as an organization. Secondly, I'll talk a little bit about, as an individual, I have very DI tendencies. If you haven't taken our community listens, we do a great DISC profile and we learn about how, as people, right, it affects sort of how we communicate with each other based on our DISC tendencies. So I highly recommend the course if you haven't taken it, but I'm a very direct type individual. I know there's some folks from MUSC on the call who probably wouldn't argue with that, right? So I'm very direct. I like to get things done. I think my motto is, why couldn't we have gotten it done yesterday? And that's really an antithesis. It's sort of the opposite of how I should be thinking about change, where I got to be able to meet people where they are and being able to really sort of resonate with that. So it's a challenge for me as an individual to not have that model of why couldn't we do it yesterday, right? Because sometimes I tell people what should be done and I expect them to do it tomorrow, and that's not always the case. And that's a struggle that I have to work on as an individual. But luckily I have some high tendency, right? So, I'm able to talk about, what folks did last weekend, or, how do they, sort of experience some of this. So being able to listen effectively and understand what people need to be able to process it in an effective way is always helpful. Just leaning into respect, being able to listen, and being able to treat people with the heart, right, versus just the data and what needs to be done for change.
David, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Talita, I'd love to get your thoughts in this space.
Sure. I feel I'm gonna say a few things that are similar to what David said. But for me, what I think about is first connection. Connection is one of my top values, and that's really how I lead. So first connecting with all the individuals in the organization, helping them see the why behind the change, and then help them connect with the why. Those are big factors. Another thing that I've found successful is to inspire, I call them change makers. So they're not someone that, that you see that they have a direct report or a manager title, but they are the ones that influence their team. So I always like to talk to them, to bring them in, to explain, bounce ideas back and forth. That seems to be helpful. And also inspire the leaders, the managers, the supervisors. have their buy-in. So it comes from the top down, and it seems almost like organic. We're setting the tone. That's what we're doing, and we know why. That's the direction we are all walking towards together. Some struggles I have experienced are related to scheduling. We are a ski town, so we're really seasonal. I'm still trying to find out if it's best to schedule, to initiate a change, or even schedule the classes offered through the Chapman Foundation in the off season and the busy season. And then we have weather. We have a lot of snow here at times, so that's really tricky. When they all have to leave and go plow the roads, and they cannot come in for a training, for a session, for a roundtable.
Talita, thank you. Erin, you're up next.
Well, being a credit union, I'm not sure how familiar everybody is with credit unions, but our goal is to serve the community and our members and our employees the best that we can, provide the best services and experiences that we can. And in my experience with our organization, the best I can describe change here is it's like the Wild West. So everyone, it's like this big ball of change, and everyone is kind of out for themselves. We all have things that are really important to each of us individually that we really want to see get done, and it's almost siloed at times, and we're working through this with a lot of the skills that I'm learning from the Chapman Foundation. But before, it was every man for themselves, and we really were all moving in different directions for change. So obviously that provided some struggles. The communication was not there. The things that each person felt was important to communicate was different. And there was no alignment with our strategy. There was no thought out plan. It was just, I don't know if anybody's familiar with the shiny object syndrome, but we had that still to a degree. We still have that a little bit, where if you're not familiar with it, it's like you see this new latest greatest thing and you've got to have it. We've got to all do it now. But times 15, because everyone had their really important thing to do. So that was a super big struggle for us as an organization, and for me individually, because I was a victim of the shiny object syndrome too. I thought my things were the most important and we need to do these things. But as I'm sure we'll talk about, it really comes down to impact, and so for us, that's where we're starting to see things align more, is when we can align them with our impact and what we're trying to do as an organization. So
Erin, thank you for sharing that. And all three of you just being willing to kind of set the tone that even if we feel kind of comfortable with change, there are still these challenges and struggles that happen both within individual people, but also organizations as a whole. And in our last session, where we kind of did a deeper dive into what it looks like to lead in a world where things constantly change, we did some reference to Kotter's 8 steps for leading change. And in there, you'll see on the very far left in those purple images there, all of these 8 steps tend to fall in these 3 different categories, right? We as leaders need to be mindful and intentional around creating the right climate for change. How are we painting the vision for what's going to happen? How are we bringing people together and along in the process? And all of those lead up to engaging and enabling the organization. How do we prepare? How do we empower people to be able to act and identify those quick wins? And then that third part, which is where you're actually implementing the change, but also finding ways to make sure that it is sustainable. So again, as Erin mentioned, it's not this shiny object where we just say that we do it, and once it's done, we move on, and everything kind of falls out of place. And so for the 3 of you on the panel, we'd like to talk a little bit more about these 8 steps of change. So I'd be curious to hear which steps in this model did you focus on to leverage change in a more systematic way? How did you leverage this intentionality of the different phases? And then if you would like, feel free to expand on that with maybe some skill sets and mindsets that helped you or your organization along the way. And for this one, Talita, do you mind going first for us?
I'm happy to. So I think about enabling action by removing barriers for acceleration and how to sustain the acceleration. As we talked about earlier, I think it was David that was mentioning that not everybody's on board at the same time. And I do think the consistency is key. So that's one of the skill sets. Again, I think helping everybody connect to the change, right? Like see why we're changing, and even how that has a connection with their personal goals. What is their personal why, and how does that connect with the big why that we're trying to work on here? And again, I cannot emphasize enough that staying consistent, not giving up, like, continue your path. So people see like, this is what we're really doing. This is not just something we're talking about now. We're going to change to something different later. I think consistency is key.
Thank you, Talita. Erin, we'll turn it over to you.
Sure. So to build on what Talita said with consistency, having a plan, I think is key as well. So for me, the fourth and the third and the fourth step are probably one that we've focused on the most in our organization. So letting everyone know there is an actual plan. We do have one. Communicating what that plan is. And one of the things that I have found has been the most helpful is knowing that you cannot communicate it enough. So even if I think they already know this, I've said it a million times, say it again, because everyone interprets everything differently. And it's very hard. I would say a mid-sized organization. We have about 475 employees, and it's difficult to make sure everyone's hearing the same message and taking away things from that message all consistently. So saying it many, many times has been helpful, and communicating it in different ways. So we have video communication that we use called a Monday morning message. And so we have like a video every Monday that talks about big things that are going on within the organization. And we have different guest speakers on that video. So that's an excellent way that we communicate the change. And then we also obviously have emails and Teams chats and things like that, and in-person get-togethers where we communicate change. But to build on what Talita said, that keeping it consistent, keeping that message consistent, and communicating it often has been helpful. And then really tying it to the strategic plan for us. We keep the strategic plan in front of everyone. It's on the landing page of our internal intranet. So when you log in the morning, that's one of the very first things that you see is our strategic plan. So trying to make sure that the projects that we're working on and the changes that are happening around the organization are aligned with that plan, so that everyone can get that buy-in and understand why we're making the change and where we're going with the change.
Thank you, Erin. I would imagine a few people are jotting down furiously some of those ideas of concrete ways to help support people in the process. David.
Yeah, Erin, what you said really resonated with me in being able to communicate and tie it back to our mission and vision. We do a lot of the same things, and, sort of as a theme, I'll talk about sort of the complexities of being a large organization, where before we create a sense of urgency, before we build a powerful coalition and lean on those early adopters, we really got to be intentional as an organization to do our homework and really ensure that once we communicate a message about change, or once we're asking people to change, we got to do it pretty close to, 100%. I mean, nobody's perfect, but it's pretty close to perfect, because what happens in such a large organization such as ours is if you don't do it well, everything has a ripple effect here at MUSC Health, right? So if we don't do it well, the ripple effect may not have been our intention. So really, as a large organization, if any of you are working in large organizations, making sure that you really do your homework, you have key players at the table to make some of those key decision-making, players to sort of bring it out, and then making sure that you implement that in a very strategic way, and building on that powerful coalition, knowing that what you put forth has a ripple effect for thousands and thousands of people, and it can either make or break you when it comes with change. I love what Erin said about communicate, right? I have written down communicate again, right? Communicate in different ways, communicate in different channels. And something that we've done sort of recently, that we've really put a finger on, is celebrate rewards and recognition. So really being able to positively reinforce those folks that are embracing the change and that are positive role models and stewards for our organization, we got to lift them up, right? Because the role modeling is really important to us. So if we're asking people to change and we're asking people to hop on board, we really need some of those champions and some of those role models that are going to be able to role model this in a way that is positive and in a way that brings us forward as an organization. Because as I talk about the ripple effect, if you have some of the negative naysayers, and you always will in an organization, it can really impact and influence those folks from being on board and really embracing the change. So celebrate again, communicate again, and really be intentional on how you put forth some of the communication.
Thank you. And David, I love how you mentioned earlier on in your statement about intent, right? We know that our intent does not always match the impact that we have at the end. And these intentional steps and stages for you and your team and organization to think through when you're rolling out change can kind of help close the gap in that space. Now, we as leaders can have this great idea for change, and we think we've got this wonderful plan. We're going to work the 8 steps and make it happen. And then we encounter humans. And humans tend to all, as David mentioned earlier, react very differently when they are being asked to change. And so this framework is one that we talk about in our lessons class, and we covered in greater detail on the previous session that Lainey dropped in the chat. So I'll give a quick refresher for everyone, but if you think, oh, I'd really like to learn more, feel free to watch that link as well. When we ask someone to change, or the organization makes a change that impacts people, they become aware, right? This change is revealed to them. And we use the terminology that when that happens, we've put someone in the box. And when we put someone in the box, they're going to experience some form of anxiety, some type of emotion. Some people might get resistant. Some people get anxious or worried. Some people get really excited about change, especially if it's a change that they've been advocating for. But what often happens is that when we as leaders roll out a change we're excited about and get met with anger or frustration, we can write people off if we're not careful as being slow to change or a naysayer, right? If they are expressing that initial reaction. When actually it can sometimes be helpful just to remember or to remind yourself, people feeling those emotions is actually a very normal, healthy part of managing the change process. This gives you insight as to how a person is feeling initially about the change you're proposing. And as we as leaders make space for people on our team to feel heard, for them to be able to express some of their concerns, that allows them to start moving through the box, moving through the change process. Now, these next 3 phases that I want to talk about are not always linear. They don't always happen in this clear path, but all 3 are really important when we want to consider getting people fully bought into the change that's being asked. So this first one here is acceptance. This is cognitive. This is logically the person on your team starts to understand why the organization is making the change, right? It makes sense. This other one is attachment, which is where the heart starts to get involved. People start to have a little bit of emotional buy-in and they want to see the change be successful. The anticipation phase is when people on your team start doing the tangible things to be equipped to make the change. Maybe they sign up for a training session to learn how to use a new system, or they review the new process and have someone sit down and walk them through it. And then your team member happily acts, implements the change, and everything is well with the world. Now, if you've been a part of any change process in an organization, you could probably pick up on a little bit of the sarcasm there, because it's not this smooth, seamless process. The point of this image is for us to remember that these are all of the phases that your team members go through as individuals when they're being asked to change. And how we care for and show up in that space is really important to how much trust we can build and what comfort level they have with why they're being asked to do the change. Now, some people move through this more quickly than others. And David, I believe you mentioned the early adapters, right? Some people jump right in. About 16% of your organization might fall in this space when a change happens. They might find change really exciting. They're okay with taking some risks. They don't really need to see the full plan to feel like, yep, let's go. A majority of the people in your organization fall within this rider category, the middle adapters. That's about 68%. And this group might not be actively working against the change, but they're kind of cautious. I kind of want to wait and see it out. I might want to check and see if it's actually achieving the goals that we thought it would, and then I might slowly start to make the change. Your late adapter group, or your draggers, make up about 16%. And this can be a group of people on your team that might be really fixed in the past or really like that traditional approach. Sometimes people fall in this category because they've been within an organization for so long that they've seen initiative after initiative after initiative that comes and doesn't last, right? So they kind of get this mentality of just wait it out. In a couple years, nobody will even remember we tried this. Now, just because you or one of your team members falls into one of these categories during a change doesn't mean that you are always and forever a late adapter or always and forever a middle adapter. Sometimes it's about the type of change that's being asked, or if it's something that impacts us more directly than other departments. So those are all things that might make you bounce back and forth between these three categories. So as we kick it back over to our panelists, we really know early adapters tend to be those people that are really easy to bring along. We know right in the top of our head, probably when we roll out a change, I want to make sure I've got these 3 people in the meeting with me. I know they'll be excited. But we'd like to learn from you, what have you done intentionally to help those other 2 categories, the people who might be feeling like they are in the middle or late adapter categories? For this one, Erin, why don't you get us started?
Sure. So what we found success with here at Capital is to build time in the plan almost to know that that's going to happen. So when we're part of a change and we're planning out the change, I've almost got a little person inside my head, a little persona inside my head of someone that I'm picturing that I know maybe struggles with change a little bit or isn't as adept to adapting to change or as quick as I am to adapting to change, because I'm pretty quick at it. And so building in time to the plan gives us time to listen to them. And that's personally what I've found to be the most successful, is if I can listen to somebody who is resistant to change or a slow adapter to change, they might be saying things that I've not considered before. They might not only, obviously I'm going to tune into what is concerning them, but they could also be speaking about things that are concerning other people that I don't even realize. So maybe others are afraid to say it, and this person is going to tell me about it. So listening to them can really tune me into with like other things that I might not be considering. And by doing that, and we can uncover those concerns, then what I found helpful is to involve them in the solution. Mm-hmm. So if there is some sort of a concern that never even came into my mind before, if I can, we almost call them influencers here at the credit union. We have many different branches, and so we like to have influencers at branches when we're rolling out change. Those are the people who can help us identify the concern and then give us ideas as to how to overcome it. And then I find that the buy-in is there because they're part of that solution.
Erin, thank you for sharing that. And I would imagine that for team members, seeing leaders not only take the time to listen, but to appreciate when people see in their blind spots and can bring that forward probably builds a lot of trust within your team.
Yeah, I think it does. And it's one thing to say you're going to do it, but you actually have to do it. You have to show them that you're going to do it. And kind of back to what Talita said, consistency. You can't just do it for one change and then not do it for other changes. You have to be consistent about it. And then hopefully people will understand that you've got their backs. You're thinking about them throughout this change.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. David, I'd love your thoughts. I thought I saw you nodding and smiling as Erin was sharing.
Yeah, Erin, I think you were in my brain because, I was going to say some of the same things, and I'll try to be a little more diverse in my response. But we at MUSC Health, we rely on operating in a matrix type style organization versus always top down. Because with us being so large, did I say we were a big organization? I think I did. The matrix aspect of being able to lead as a matrix is really critical when you have folks that are some of the late adopters or even middle adopters. And going back to Connor, really bringing in that guiding coalition of folks who are your champions in that matrix level of an organization that you can rely on, that can be sort of your stewards for success and stewards for those middle and late adopters who may have trouble. You know, I wrote down be present, right? As leaders, sometimes it's hard just to be present and listen. I've learned working in employee engagement that not everyone wants an answer or for you to come in with a solution. Sometimes people just want to be heard with their struggles of what they're going through with the change. So sometimes just being able to listen in silence and acknowledge that you're just there to listen and hear them is sometimes helpful, right? Just being present and something that we do or that I termed rounding for outcomes, right? So how do you round with folks on an ongoing basis as a leader, visiting different departments throughout the hospital or your organization, where you're answering questions, you're telling the why, you're meeting people where they are in terms of the box, so you're able to sort of bring them on board. And then, of course, as I said at the beginning, being able to leverage on your coalition builders and your champions and let them role model the behavior for change. Some folks need a souvenir of the past, as I call it, right? They need that nostalgic feel of, well, this is what we did 10 years ago, and here's how we're benefiting in 2024 by bringing in some of the same strategies from 10 years ago, but we're just a different organization. So, you know, some folks just need sort of that souvenir from the past, so they have that sense of nostalgia as they try to focus on moving towards something different.
David, I'd never heard that phrase, a souvenir from the past, before. I appreciate having some language behind that. David, before we move to Talita, there was a question in the chat just asking if you could explain a little bit more what you mean by matrix leadership.
Yes, I'm sorry. So, you know, instead of a top-down sort of leadership style that we're all sort of accustomed to, and in some ways very antiquated, right, is what the literature tells us. So a matrix organization is more sort of horizontal, where you're working with different departments and levels of the organization on equal playing field, especially when you're doing projects or project management. And it's not necessarily going to your one-up or senior leaders for decision-making. It's the players that are sort of at your level, but maybe in a different department within your organization where you can bring forth change or bring forth change in projects.
Thank you, David. Talita, we'll go ahead and take your response before we move into the open Q&A. So again, just a reminder to participants, if you have questions you want to drop in the chat, we'll open it up after this one. All right, Talita.
Well, it is really interesting to hear Aaron's and David's response. I'll try to not repeat a lot of what you already said. But for me, again, we are small. We have about 110 full-time year-round employees. And because we are a municipality, we have more than half of our employees, they work in person. Less than half can have a hybrid schedule. So I really make a point to go there. I go to their like break room and just bring my computer and just let them talk to me, exactly as we were discussing earlier. And sometimes, like David was saying, they just need us to listen. You know, I've caught myself many times just like listening to someone saying, this is different. I'm like, yes, it is different. And like, you know, that's where I stop. I don't try to justify why. They just need to someone else to acknowledge that it is different. And then what I try to do, because I believe if their personal why is connected to the change, then they can, you know, follow us quicker and they can see a purpose too. So I try to talk to them and help understand like what is the motivation, what is something that they can take like from the change, you know, how to connect them to the why, it connects them to the change like the others. And again, I try, when there's someone or a group of people that are really resisting, I try to go to my change makers and ask them for some input. You know, what would be helpful? Should I bring lunch and talk? Like, what would, like, individual meetings? So really connecting with them and seeing what they need and flexing that way.
I love how kind of that common theme with all three of you is really making space to connect with people and also being aware of the others in your organization who have a close pulse on what everyone's experiencing and going through. All right, that leads us now to our open Q&A, where we get to have questions from people in the audience, or if any of you on the panel thought, oh, I would really like to ask this question to someone else on the panel, please feel free to do that as well. Lainey or Heather, if either of you have a question to pose or one that's coming from the chat, I'll go ahead and pause here.
Well, we're giving people time to kind of consider what they want to put in the chat and what question they want to ask. I think one of the things that comes to my mind as all of you were speaking is you touched on this idea of planning really has to happen before you're changing, right? This has to be a part of your vision, your mission. You have to get it on the calendar so that it doesn't get ahead of you. And I'm just curious, when you talk about that planning that has to happen ahead of time, because this is probably not my strength, I'm curious what strategies you have used to make sure that that planning is happening and it's getting on your calendar. And while that sounds like maybe an obvious question, I'm guessing you each have some strategy about how you tackle that collaboratively.
And for this portion, it's open to whoever wants to respond first. So for any of you on the panel, feel free to just come off mute.
I can share a little bit. So I don't know if everybody's familiar with DISC, but here we did a team DISC for our directors, and then we're able to identify our group profile, and it happens that we like have 25% of each DISC style, which is good. We have a lot of different opinions, but also we take a long time to make decisions. So again, like knowing who we are, knowing the profile for a group, that's one thing to take into consideration before bringing it to the table. I usually ask all the directors their opinion, and I also try to be mindful of times of the year when things are busy, right? Like I try, because we're ski town, I try to not have a lot going on during the winter months, or if you're gonna have a whole month of, for example, open enrollment, I think it would be too overwhelming to also throw like trainings in that month. So I try to like pace throughout the year with things that I know are going to happen, and also give everybody enough time to share their opinion, knowing that we are a group that will tend to take a long time to make a decision.
Thank you, Talita. Erin, I thought I saw you come off mute. Do you have something you'd like to add?
Yeah, it's actually very similar to what Talita had said, that like we know that, so we have a regular change management meeting. It's every week we have a regular change management meeting, and that's where the visibility on the bigger changes that are happening throughout the organization are discussed. And I would say without a doubt, everyone knows that you don't go through a change alone here. So we have a team of people that will help you with the change, whatever it may be. And those people vary depending on what the change is. So it's easier to keep it top of mind and on the calendar because you've got more than one brain and more than one person supporting that change and holding each other accountable and on schedule for those changes and those plans that we're developing. So we found a lot of success with having like a change management committee and discussing those changes and keeping them very visible, like what Talita said, so you're not overlapping changes and pushing too much on people at once.
Thank you, Erin. David, do you have anything you want to add before we move on to the next question?
I'm a big fan of project management tools to keep me on track because I know sometimes I can't do it alone. So having, project calendars that affect the team, just simple Gantt charts on deadlines and when things need to be accomplished. Because if you're anything like me, the day gets away from me and I'm wondering what I even did today, right? Because I was in a bunch of meetings. So using tools, strategies, spreadsheets, Gantt charts, and if you have project managers in your organization, they're great stewards to help you push change and make sure that you're on deadlines.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and turn back to the chat. We have a few more questions that came in. This first one, do any of you find that for the late adapters, once they felt heard, do they really try to adapt at some point? I think we're looking for some hope here. Erin, go ahead.
I don't know if I'm going to give hope. I'm going to be honest. I think it depends on the change. Sometimes I've found that it doesn't happen. And I know that that's probably not the answer that we're hoping to hear. I think more often than not, they eventually do get on board, although it can take a very long time. But if we're talking about something that's a major change for someone, it can almost go against their values depending on what the change is. So for example, let's say it's a change in supervisor, or it's a change, you are consistently in the office and now we're asking you to work from home, and that is not your jam. You are not a work from home person. That leads oftentimes to conversations about, okay, I get that you are not going to be accepting of this change because it's directly against everything that is important to you. So what does that mean? Where does that leave us? And sometimes we'll part ways because it's not going to work, but on good terms, because I totally understand that that's not going to work for you. And obviously we will try to look for options to work. But if there are no options, this is going to be your new supervisor, we have to go to work from home, that sort of thing. Sometimes I've found that they don't adapt to the change.
Erin, I appreciate the authenticity in the response. David or Talita, anything you want to add before we move to the next one?
I resonate with sort of Erin's comments. It's never fun to have those difficult conversations around accountability. But I wouldn't say often, but there are some situations where I have to have conversations with leaders, and I phrase it in a way of, are they liabilities to the team and to the organization? Or can we get them on board and can we meet them in the box and will they change? But unfortunately, there are some folks, small percentages of people, that unfortunately do become liabilities of the organization. And your culture sometimes doesn't benefit from that, oftentimes doesn't benefit from that. So sometimes you do have to have those effective confrontation skills. If you've tried everything, you've done Cotter, you've done the mocks, you've had critical conversations, you've done counseling, I'm saying go through the list. And if they're still not on board, unfortunately, it does become a more critical conversation or a crucial conversation.
And I love the attention drawn to, even if we get to that point, how we model that relationship of care along the way really makes a big difference, even if people end up parting ways in that space. Thank you both. All right, this question has multiple parts to it, and so we're looking for some concrete examples. Could any of you speak to a specific change that you've implemented and why? What were some of the concerns you heard about the change that maybe you hadn't considered? So thinking of some of those blind spots, and how did you respond to those? And then the final question, you can just respond to what part of this question resonates for you. Was there anything that made the change even more successful by choosing to listen to those concerns, the blind spots that you might not have been aware of? Erin, go for it.
Sorry, I feel like I'm first to volunteer for all of these things, but I, like a lot of you, probably have a ton of change happening. One that comes to mind, and I wanted to talk about this in this context because it's a change we ended up not implementing. So we had determined that we were going to switch credit card vendors here at the credit union, and we were not happy with the service that we were getting from our current credit card vendor and the products that we were getting from them. And we decided we are going to switch to this other vendor. They were going to be better. And so through that process, we determined and listened to our employees who were part of the soft launch phase. So we had several employees who took out this new credit card and then called in with service issues and things like that. It didn't go well. It in fact was not, it was about the same, if not worse, than the current vendor that we had. And we would not have known that because we didn't, all of us did not have the card ourselves. So we relied on those employees and listened to what they had to say. And ultimately, what we did was we turned around and had a conversation with our original vendor. And we said, these are the things we're unhappy with. We are thinking about switching. Can you make this right? And they did. And now it's super successful because they listened to us, because we listened to our people. So it's more a change that we didn't implement because we listened to those people. And what we did was very transparent, because we had told the entire organization, hey, we are rolling out with this new credit card vendor. Get ready. Here's the training. Who wants to be part of the soft launch? And then we had to go back and say, you know what? We're not, because it's just not, it doesn't feel right. And we've heard you, and we reached out and made our current experience better.
Erin, thank you for being willing to share that example. David or Talita, anything that you can add from your organizations or experience?
I have an example too. So we're wrapping that up. We just started using software for our performance evaluations. So before, they used to use a form that employees didn't have access to the form, to the answers right after the reviews were done. And it was a big thing, right? When I was looking for vendors, I had like a team of people demoing the products with me. And then when we were ready to start rolling over, we have an employee committee. They're some of the change makers that I mentioned earlier. So I showed them first. I showed all the directors first. And then we started using in one department at a time. So we were getting feedback from different departments. Like I said, we have a transportation department. They don't have a computer. They're bus drivers. And most of the time, they don't even like a computer. So for them, I had to be available, I had to be there, have IT with me. So I really do, like, as a team effort, explaining why. And the big why in this case was really that, a lot of people are uncomfortable getting feedback on a performance review setting, especially if it's tied to a potential raise. If technology is a barrier, if what they were using before here did not work, that even made it worse. Like, let's make it easy with technology so those conversations can happen in a more like organic and pleasant manner. So that's one. And then answering, that was a piece of the question, like, what we implement. I implemented a lot of the feedback that I got. And there were sometimes minor things. For example, the definition for average and successful, they are really far, like that doesn't make sense. So I implemented a lot of changes, and I think it made it better because also most of people felt like they matter, was their buy-in, they were heard again. But of course, if someone were to make a recommendation like, okay, stop with this, let's use a different one, I'm like, well, we're kind of late in the game. Tell me. I would go more like the route that Erin was talking about, like, what are you looking for that you're not seeing here? How can we make this happen in a way that you think should happen? I think listening to people is really the number one. Most of them, honestly, don't think they care if we implement the recommendation or not. They really care. They will remember if they felt heard or not.
It's a beautiful reminder, Talita. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just quickly share just, in sort of in summary, wrapping both Talita and Erin's perspectives. We implemented recently a large enterprise IT system that replaced over 100 existing systems. So you can imagine what the complexity of that was and what a struggle that was. But what we intentionally did as an organization was to ensure we heard the voices of the key players where this affects payroll, right? Other systems. I'm not an IT person, so all the other systems, and really being able to hear what their concerns are and how we might be able to mitigate harm before we go live with the product. Now, it's not a perfect world where we're going to be able to hear everyone's concerns and say, oh, there'll be a strategy for that, or this system will do that, or it won't do that. But what we were able to do is come to an agreement on what was expected with the system. We heard your voice, and we're going to try to mitigate this concern before we go live. Or if we didn't hear those voices and those concerns around the table, it could have been a disaster.
Thank you, David. Erin, this next question is geared towards a comment that you had made previously. But David and Talita, if you have other formats that you currently use in your organization, we'd love to hear from you after Erin responds. Could you please expand on the weekly change management meeting that you mentioned? Do you have a standing agenda? And how do you choose who has a seat at this table?
Sure. So it's every Tuesday at 3 p.m. So it is a standing time, and it is a virtual meeting, so we can include as many as possible. But who's represented in the meeting is at least one person from every department. And sometimes, like, if I can't make it, I'll have another leader in my department go. So we kind of decide who's going to go that week. And then always a few representatives from the branch. area, because it's important for them also to have a seat at the table. So they work amongst themselves to determine who is going to go to that meeting. But it is a standing agenda. And what we talk about are changes in progress, changes that are pending approval. So this team talks about approving changes as well. Not everything is approved. Changes that are completed, and I think that's it. Those few items. And so it's a quicker meeting. I would say 30 minutes or so, or less, depending on how many changes we have in place. But it just provides that visibility, and we're all talking about the changes, and we're all supporting the changes. And there's a good amount of healthy debate in that meeting as well. If one of us feels, or several of us feel strongly against a change or for a change. But it's a great opportunity to have everybody's voices heard from all around the organization.
Erin, what a great way to proactively be seeing in some of those blind spots. David or Talita, any other areas that you'd want to share from your organizations as it relates to how to work together as a team for making change?
A lot, I think I alluded to this a few minutes ago. A lot of our change projects are governed or facilitated by our enterprise project management team. So we have a dedicated department that helps guide change processes and projects. We have project managers that are assigned to different areas of our organization where their primary job is project management, and they guide folks through the process. So that's really helpful. I love Erin's idea of the project management team. I was a little shocked though, where I don't know that our meetings will be 30 minutes, but y'all are really good at facilitation, because ours would go on for hours. But that's generally what a lot of our departments, larger departments, do is bring on those project managers.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. Talita.
I was just gonna add that for me, like I mentioned, we have a lot more employees that work in person only than hybrid. So this is something I always have to think about. How can I hear all voices and implement something that makes sense to everybody? And again, if I'm asking everyone to use a computer to fill out their performance review, like, I gotta make laptops available, iPads, they can schedule time to talk to me or IT. So I really try to think of ways to remove all possible obstacles to each different department and how they operate, in even like the what they have available there.
Thank you. And it looks like we had one additional question come in to wrap us up for this portion of the training. It talks about how we showed at the beginning of this training that 70% of org changes end up failing. Not that this has happened to any of you on the panel, but could you talk about how you track the success of your changes and make adjustments if things are going off the rails? Considering things like, how do you know, and how do you course correct if you need to?
I think for me, just in my leadership experience and as a culture here at MUSC Health, I think when you see things are falling off the rails or things aren't going in the direction we need to, I think just being more intentional with presence as a leader. We have some terminology internal that we use that, if you're in healthcare, you may be familiar with, maybe daily stand-ups, where we expect as a team, everyone to literally, do a stand-up of where they are with the project and sort of the progress they're making, any barriers to success. We often do huddles. We often do more intentional presence with the team if we feel like things are not going quite as successfully. We're held accountable as leaders, obviously, right? If we just kind of let things fall off the rails. So again, as leaders, I think we have that responsibility to be more present and expect your team to do a daily stand-up or do those huddles and really talk through those concerns and what might be going well or not, and what do you need from each other to ensure that it's getting back on track.
Go ahead, Erin.
I hope this won't get me in trouble, but I have a really hard time with the concept that 70% end in failure, because define failure. I mean, I guess you could say that our credit card initiative failed because we didn't go with that other vendor, but did it fail? Because instead it strengthened the relationship that we had with our original vendor, and we learned something in the process that we can apply to future projects. So failure is a tough word there. I have a really hard time thinking of any change that we've ever had that has truly ended in failure. I think that there's a lot to learn. And David, I think you hit on it exactly. The way that we manage through that change is by meeting often and discussing and having regular checkpoints on things and not being afraid to adjust from your plan when you have it made, and just really think about all the different aspects of the change and how it's going to impact the organization.
Erin, I will say definitely not in trouble for saying that.
Okay.
I loved the reframing of the failure and that reminder that we as leaders being open to the idea that our original thought for change might not be the right path forward really keeps people in the forefront. So thank you for sharing that.
May I add something quick?
Yeah, please do.
You know, I think in order to have that level of vulnerability as a team requires a high level of trust. And I know someone mentioned that earlier, but I want to make sure that we emphasize that in order for change to be successful at any department or organization, despite your size or what type of leader you are, you got to have a high level of trust within your organization. Or, you know, people are going to hide things from you. They're not going to tell you the truth, or they're going to say, yeah, I'm on board, and they're really not. And then they leave, right? I mean, I could go on, but, you know, and the folks that are on the call from MUSC, they're probably tired of me talking about trust, because I talk about trust on a daily basis, where if you don't have a foundation of trust to build upon, you can't build a house, right? You can't build a house on a cracked foundation. So the question becomes, as leaders, how do we regroup so we build a foundation of trust and people are vulnerable and they feel open to speak to us about hard things when things aren't going well? That's when we implement change. We don't implement change in the middle of chaos and when things are erratic. It's not the right way, and it's not going to be the right outcome.
David, I love that reminder about the critical role that trust plays. Trust was actually the very first session that we did in this series. And so for those of you who were hoping to have some tools to bring back to your teams to talk about, how do I have a conversation around trust? And what are some trust building behaviors that we as a team can focus on? There'll be an opportunity for you to get some of that information after this session as well. So thank you. I wish we had 2 hours to continue to hear all of the thoughts and insights, and I always appreciate the real live examples of how this work is playing out in the different organizations, in different sectors, in different sizes of organizations. So I really appreciated the time and want to just really quickly wrap us up here, because this concept of everything that we cover in the series focuses on 3 different elements. Me, how are we increasing our own personal awareness of the roles that we play? And in this example of organizational change, the we, how are we building a culture of we-centric behaviors and mindsets with our team members? And the us, how are we impacting the organization as a whole and creating this environment where people feel seen and cared for and heard? And you 3 have given such beautiful examples of how that is playing out in your day-to-day work. So again, at the end of all of these sessions, or for you if it's your first time, just a couple of next steps. There's a quick survey that you have an opportunity to complete. Every previous session has been recorded, so you can respond to the email you'll get in case there's any additional information or take back tools that you'd like to bring to your group, or if you would like to ask us about additional trainings. So we hope to see you on the next call, and a huge thank you again to all of you for joining us. Bye, everyone.